Hello, everybody, all our audience from across the globe, and thanks again to the Gulf International Forum for allowing a really good and serious discussion of what happens next in Iran after the death of the Prime Minister, wrong country, after the death of the President Ebrahim Raisi. Uh, the This comes at a particularly interesting time because the region and the world, as a matter of fact, is in a certain amount of uproar. In addition to the Ukraine, clashes with fire hoses between Philippine and Chinese patrol boats, uh, an American election coming up that no one knows how it will turn up, and finally, an outright full-scale war in Gaza between the Palestinians through Hamas and Israel that has actually uh, ended up with the first direct exchange of and between Iran and Israel. So these are very, very touchy times. Uh, Last week, we saw the International Criminal Court announce that it would seek indictments against the Israeli Prime Minister, the Israeli Minister of Defense, and three leaders of Hamas. Again, almost unheard of. The latter part that we are actually seeking indictments against the ruler of against senior politicians of what is essentially a Western country. We've never done this before. Uh, and then the death of the president at a time when the Islamic Republic of Iran is facing challenges that I personally believe are much more serious than at any time in its history since its founding in 1979, 1980. We now have an enormous domestic economic issue. Iran has been drawn into the Ukraine war, supplying robots, supplying military equipment, drones, and so forth to the Russian army, and uh, is in another face-off with America's traditional enemy, while its economy uh, goes down, and there is a great deal of internal turmoil over cultural and social issues, for want of a better term, such as the wearing of the hijab. So, this sounds, personally, I think this sounds very much like the Soviet Union compressed in time. Others have mentioned this as well, but in the Soviet Union, ideology constantly warred with pragmatism, and in the end, the system collapsed because the ideology remained in power too long. Uh, so, if I can just make a comparison that may or may not be valid, are we in a period of Khrushchev, of Brezhnev, or Gorbachev in the succession to Iran? We've brought a really good bunch of speakers together to discuss this. Uh, uh, on Mrs. Holly Dagres. She is a non-resident senior fellow at the Washington-based think tank, the Atlantic Council, and the editor of the Council's Iran Source blog and curator for the Council's weekly newsletter, the Iranist, excuse me. She will speak to us of the consequences for internal issues, economy, dissent, uh, uh, secondly, Dr. Hamidreza Azizi, a visiting fellow of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, SWP, will talk about the succession process in, for governing party dynamics, this Khrushchev to Gorbachev idea that I was talking about. And finally, Dr. Abdolrasool Divsallar, a senior researcher for the Middle East Weapons of Mass Destruction Free Zone, the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Proposals. He will uh, talk about Iran's external affairs and they how the world impacts on Iran, or Iran impacts on the world. And now, just to get this underway quickly, we have a lot to cover. Holly.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to give a bit of an overview about Raisi himself and unpack it in the context of the Iranian society. So when news broke on May 19th that President Ebrahim Raisi's helicopter had suffered a hard landing and that Iranian search and rescue teams were having trouble finding it, Iranian youth quickly resorted to posting mostly dark memes and jokes about the incident. One of the common themes was a photo of a bear and or a wolf. So, for example, one user had wrote the caption, "The hope is of the nation is with you two," referring to people hoping that Raisi gets eaten or mauled to death by wild animals. Other comments were like, "If Raisi is really dead, I'll name my first son Helicopter." Others also said, "Don't get too excited, let's pray first for his death." So the reason I'm highlighting these social media posts is because it really signified just how low the clerical establishment is, but also how much hate was specifically reserved for Raisi, who's been widely known as the Butcher of Tehran, for his role as serving as on one of the death commissions that sent political prisoners en masse to their deaths in what became known as the 1988 massacre. Rights organizations like Amnesty International believe it to be on the level of crimes against humanity. The uncharismatic Raisi would climb the ranks of the clerical establishment, becoming custodian of the powerful Astana Quds Razavi, a powerful foundation tied to the Imam Reza shrine in Mashhad, where he hails from. In 2017, he ran for president, famously appearing next to rapper Tantalu with tatted up sleeves to garner the youth vote. That was not successful because Raisi lost the presidency to incumbent President Hassan Rouhani. But being the loyal servant he was to the Nizam, or system, he was granted the role of judiciary chief, allowing him to continue his legacy of violent crackdowns. In 2021, in a highly engineered election, Raisi was handed the presidency on a silver platter to continue Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's vision of an Islamic Republic 2.0, ensuring the regime is dominated by relatively young and pious in all branches of government, parliament, judiciary, and the presidency. But it was under Raisi's presidency that the 2022 Women Life Freedom Uprising rocked all 31 of Iran's provinces. He led a vicious crackdown on freedom-seeking protesters with more than 550 killed, including 68 children, and up to 60,000 arrested, according to the United Nations fact-finding mission, which also said the response amounted to crimes against humanity. Raisi's bloody legacy and the brutal regime he helped bolster is why Iranians celebrated the news of his demise on May 20th. Upon confirmation of his death, Iranians uploaded dance videos and congratulated each other. In Raisi's home city of Mashhad, a young woman without mandatory hijab wrote on a wall with spray paint, "Khamenei will be next." Realizing how elated Iranians were, authorities quickly announced that anyone seen celebrating the deaths would be arrested. Tweets were quickly deleted and several were detained and charged, including a journalist and the wife of a soccer star. I know that some of you, as you hear me talk about this, are thinking about the images and footage from Raisi's funeral. And I have to say, those who are attending are a mixed bag, and I'm going to unpack that a bit. I would first start by saying some Iranians are attending simply because a president dying in office is a spectacle of a lifetime, and they want to be part of history. Others were bussed in. Those Iranians are infamous for their loyalty being up for sale in return for fruit juice, or in Persian, as we say, sandiskhor. But I think we really have to respect the fact that the Islamic Republic does have its small number of supporters, but that number decreases year by year. And I'd like to just briefly do the math on that. So if we were to take the election numbers at face value, Raisi was voted in with 16 million, and the parliamentary election saw 25 million participants, both which were the lowest turnout in the Islamic Republic's history. So the average on that would be 20.5 million supporters. That's 23% of the country's 90 million population, well below the 30% rule for an authoritarian regime to survive. The Islamic Republic recognizes this, and high-ranking officials have even publicly discussed it. The leadership at the top knows that it has lost the support of the majority of its people, especially the youth, Iranian Gen Z, or Dae Hashtadiya as they're known in Persian, which make up to 60% of the country's 90 million population. But rather than change its ways and adjust to the realities on the ground, the Islamic Republic is only doubling down on any form of dissent and passing draconian laws like the hijab and chastity bill. The clerical establishment is also taking lessons from history. They saw how the Shah compromised which led to partly to his ouster. And with a new generation of youth unwilling to bend to their will and live behind closed doors, their only solution is to push them back in with a brutal response. The next president, which will be determined on June 28th in a presidential election, will likely be ultra-conservative, or also these days known as super revolutionary, meaning even more hardline than Raisi, but will continue his brutal legacy of cracking down on any form of dissent. But Iranian Gen Z isn't having it. These youth see how the rest of the world lives and want that for themselves too. So what I'm trying to say is that the Islamic Republic can poison schoolgirls, shoot them with bullets and beat them to death with batons, or arrest them for wearing a dress or shorts in public, but they're going to still remain defiant. This disconnect between the geriatric leadership at the top and the burgeoning youth population is only growing as the months go by. The Islamic Republic has to deal with many crises of their own making, but it's this generation that isn't having any of it and will hopefully knock off this turban of repression.
Quick and concise and very, that was quick and concise and very informative, I think, to our audience. I confess, I've been all around, I've served all around Iran. I never served there, never visited, yet it is a fascinating country that we don't know much about truly in the West. Dr. Hamidreza, please.
Hello, thank you very much for organizing this very timely panel and for having me. I will try to focus on the intra-elite dynamics actually and how they are going to be impacted by the death of Raisi with an eye on the issue of post-Khamenei succession. Of course, we are hearing a lot about it these days. I'm not going to go into speculation about who's going to be the next supreme leader. Simply, it's too early to speak about that, especially because of this incident. But let me start by saying that the issue of transition and succession has been actually a key driver of politics in Iran over the past few years. A lot of things that we have seen and we are seeing from the so-called campaign of purification, as they call it, purification of political space in the sense that they are sidelining all moderate and reformist figures to heighten factional rivalries, intelligence leaks, media leaks, all these kinds of things. Most of them at least have something to do with the intra-elite rivalries and factional rivalries with an eye to the looming succession. And for that reason, one can imagine how the death of a president, and not any president, a president who was kind of very trusted and favored by the current supreme leader Khamenei and the kind of the strongest part, at least, of the deep state in Iran, how it's going to impact it. So, first of all, of course, it will intensify the internal power struggles. For example, and this is the most recent case, before the incident already, and as a result of the recent parliamentary election, there was already, competing camps within, of course, the hardliners who are in the parliament to basically take over the position of the Speaker of the Parliament. This was evident, of course, in the ultra-hardline end of Iran's political spectrum, represented by the Stability Front, or in Persian, Jabhe Paidari, and their allies in the parliament basically trying to form a sort of coalition to oust the, Mohammad Ghalibaf, actually the former Speaker of the Parliament, who is in the current parliament as well. So now that his fortune is rather gloomy, Ghalibaf may see an opportunity actually for to run for presidency, and his name is actually mentioned these days as one of the potential candidates. He belongs to, for the sake of the discussion, actually, for the more pragmatic end of the hardline faction, and he does have the support among the part of the elite and also part of the proponents of the Islamic Republic, which, as Holly rightly mentioned, is seems to be the minority in the country these days. So this is one of the immediate impacts that we are going to see, if not the person of Ghalibaf, at least this kind of ultra hardliners versus the so-called traditional conservatives, I mean, those who still remain in the political scene. That is one of the immediate impacts of the death of Raisi, actually, the competition between the camps. But the thing is that, one of the factors that we need to take into account is that for the political system, for the person of the supreme leader and his entourage, those who have been basically trying to make sure that transition is going to be smooth and in their favorable direction, finding someone in such a short notice to replace Raisi is very difficult. And there lies the significance of the death of Raisi, I think. So, because Raisi had three main characteristics that made him the favorite candidate, and all the efforts that the political system did in the latest presidential election in 2021 to make sure that he was going to be the president. So first of all, Raisi was a true loyalist to Khamenei and the ideological foundations of the Islamic Republic. And this has been admitted frequently by Khamenei himself, both before his death and also in these past few days since his death, actually. The second one, which is an irony, but very important with regard to Raisi, was that he was actually a weak president. Even by the narrow standards of the Islamic Republic, when we compared him with figures like Hassan Rouhani or even Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who from time to time would not shy away from sort of directly or indirectly challenging the deep state, challenging the IRGC, and at the end of the day, at least having a strategic vision of their own in foreign and domestic politics, Raisi lacked these characteristics. And the third characteristic was that he was a true insider. He was a cleric who rose to power step by step within the system, and as a result, he was trusted and supported by parts of the elite, and again, the social base of the government alike. So the thing is that, for example, considering Ghalibaf as an option for the next presidency, he shares the third characteristic. He is also basically, he used to be at least an insider. He also rose to fame and power gradually from within the system, but he would be in the same category as people like Rouhani and Ahmadinejad in terms of having a more independent personality and some sort of strategic vision. And also because of his background, his basic track record of being an opportunist, swinging between moderates and conservatives from time to time, it makes him kind of less likely to be trusted by the supreme leader and the core leadership of the IRGC. So I think here, before we go into the details of, so this is actually my main argument. So the death of Raisi, the main importance, the main significance is the way it is going to impact the process of transition to post-Khamenei and the succession process, because no matter who is going to be the next supreme leader, or whether or not there is such a thing as a kind of as a candidate already known, or whether Raisi was the candidate, or it is Mojtaba Khamenei, whatever, it is important for this specific faction of the conservatives, those loyalists to Khamenei, those sort of center to far right in the conservative camp, to make sure that they have control over all the three branches of the government in order to have a smooth transition process. So for that reason, I think, first of all, and this is where I'm going to end, first of all, we are going to see very controlled and as it is called in Iran, engineered electoral process once again. But of course, the problem is who is going to take over, and that would be significant. But in any case, the political system is not going to allow any outsider to come and take over this position, even if it means that they are going to see, lowest public participation in the history of the Islamic Republic. So stability of the system towards succession is more important. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamidreza. I can't imagine that you get a lot of people to turn out for the election. We still haven't seen a list of candidates unless something's happened in the last couple of hours. Has the or what's it called, the council that will select the candidates, has it met yet? Is it meeting now?
The list of the candidates are not known yet, and the process has not started. And all these names are just speculations. We still don't know. It's about, for example, people mentioned Mohammad Mokhber, the current caretaker president, and Raisi's vice president, actually. But the problem would be that he needs to first resign and then, sign up for the election, which would make it create another challenge, because him being a person close to the IRGC, taking care of the executive branch until the election would make sure that at least a certain level of stability is going to be there. So as I said, it's very delicate and challenging, this kind of less than 2 months ahead. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And that, meanwhile, the outside world is looking in with great interest and some concern and trepidation. Dr. Abdolrasool, your thoughts, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. Let me first thank you and the Institute for having me here. To answer your questions, I think we need to look at two factors which are playing an important role here. The first factor is the quality and duration of a transitional process to the next presidency. I think that's quite an important factor, how long it takes and what quality basically it has, more than the timing of this. The power vacuum in the system can have consequences, especially given the fact that foreign ministry and the presidency role in many foreign policy files have been already under pressure and influence of factors outside government by conservative political fractions and the IRGC, which have had a major influence in a lot of these files. So the lack of presidents and his foreign minister at this point may provide a space and opportunity to those institutions outside the government to see a moment in pushing their foreign policy agenda. For example, the role of Quds forces and IRGC and other religious institutions run by Office of the Leader can be even more than before. We can always expect higher ceilings for their role and their influence. We have witnessed that before, how such critical junctures played a role in the structure and content of Iran's foreign policy. For example, when we should not forget that the rise of the Quds forces after the Iraq war was basically related to that sort of critical juncture, an incident, a moment that gave the momentum for the rise of a certain part of the institution inside Islamic Republic. So what I'm claiming is that I'm not claiming that we are witnessing such a critical juncture. Yet the quality, as I said, and duration of this process can define whether we are seeing it, whether at the end of these 40 days, 50 days until the next president comes and until he takes the office, will we see a more stronger institutions, more bigger role by RGC and Quds Force and other institutions, which even we might not necessarily think about them at this moment. The second factor is the current structure, looking at current structure and model of Iran's foreign policy decision-making. I oppose the argument that it usually is raised that the leader is the only and the most significant actor in Iran's foreign policy and security decision-making. It's true that he sets a framework and directions and holds a very important arbitrary position that plays a strategic role there. But the actual content and the decisions are also largely influenced by the domestic balance of force among different political fractions. So I referred, I've largely explored these dynamics in a chapter that I published last year with Dr. Mehran Kamrava in his book, The Sacred Republic, of that, how these institutions are working. In short, the president and foreign minister have both an institutional and personal influence over the agenda setting and the direction of debates. That explains why the foreign ministry under foreign policy under different presidents like Khatami, Rouhani, and Ahmadinejad were different from each other, and they pursued different foreign policy agendas. For this matter, I argue that who would be the next president matters a lot and can speed up some processes while slows down others. For example, a reformist or moderate government that sees the resolution of issues with the US as the priority might not have strong appetite to focus on the regional files, or may have different, cost-benefit analysis about Iran's provision of military assistance to Russian war efforts in Ukraine. However, as was mentioned by Dr. Azizi, I completely agree that the current understanding, at least the current situation, shows that we would probably should expect a sort of continuation of Raisi foreign policy, given that the conservative camp is determined to continue securing its position in the process of succession. In fact, the condition that led to the engineering of presidential election in 2021 persists as of today. So the main condition was the role that a conservative government could play in the succession process, as was mentioned by Dr. Azizi. Since these conditions has not changed, I don't see any reason to believe that there might be the opening or a change of approach in the way next election is going to be held. That means we should probably expect a sort of Raisi II government and a continuation of his foreign policy. While, as I said, I don't expect change in long term in the content of foreign policy making, yet I think the immediate short-term effect of the incident can have effects on the opportunistic nature of Iran's foreign policy. In fact, we can expect that country's bureaucratic system will slow down in the transitional period, and its representation and articulation of some of its foreign policy agendas in the region could experience some difficulties or slowdowns. This can procedurally impact progress in some critical foreign policy files, such as the regional dialogue with the Arab states, Iran's Gaza war policy, and even the nuclear talks with the United States. We already have seen its impact on the nuclear file, as was mentioned by IEA Director General about the postponing of its agency's negotiations with Tehran over the ongoing discussions between the two. Another example is that Tehran, is going to lose the golden time to engage with Biden administration before election. And as we know, probably before the election, this was one of the agenda in the current political dynamic in Tehran, to somehow revive the talks with the Biden administration and find pathways for future. So all in all, there are other certain areas of foreign policy that are not at all going to have any change. Among the most important part of that is Iran's military and defense strategy. When we talk about Iran's regional policy, as we all know, certain aspects of those regional policies are clearly linked with Iran's military strategy. Those areas are not the candidates of any change, neither in short term or nor in long term, given the actors and agents who are engaged on those areas are very much fixed, and the death of the foreign minister or the president is not going to impact them. Basically, there are the RGC, the Artesh, and the General Staff of Armed Forces. However, as I said, the better picture, saying all these conceptual frameworks and have a sort of view of how we can have different baskets of Iran's foreign policy and analyze its impact, the impact of the death of the foreign minister and the president on each of these baskets separately. Some of them will have more impacts, as I said, like I think the regional file is one of them, the nuclear file is one of them that we will see a slowdown in sort of ongoing debates and and positions. However, other areas like the axis of resistance, Iran's regional intervention in other countries, Iran's military security assistance to its axis of resistance, these are not going to change by no means because of the death of the president or its foreign minister. So I conclude my point, and the core argument is that the understanding that how the impact of this death would be very much depends on who would be the next president and what file of foreign policy we are talking about. Thank you.
You painted, the three of you have given us, I think, a more complete description of Iran and the situation it is in right now than many that I've heard for a long, long time. Congratulations on that. I would like to ask, before we get to the next president, there's roughly 7 weeks. And in a world in which things have been going wrong on a big scale all the time, how prepared or how competent is the current administration, the interim president, to handle, say, a major international crisis that affects Iran? Something, say, a major clash with the Taliban in Afghanistan, something deteriorating suddenly between Azerbaijan and Armenia again. Can the structure react to it in a practical way? I'll take that for anybody. Holly?
Sure. Well, I'd start by saying that interim president Mohammad Mokhber has an economic background, and he was part of an administration that was considered one of the most incompetent of the Islamic Republic's 45-year history. Having that been said, he's also leaning on foreign policy chops with the Supreme National Security Council, and of course, the Supreme Leader himself, who resides as the key decision maker and arguably the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So I think that for him, what's going to be the task is actually carrying out what is being said. And we've seen in recent months reported infighting between the foreign ministry and the IRGC in instances like the tit for tat attacks in Pakistan. I don't know if folks remember, but just months before the tit for tat between Iran and Israel, Iran had attacked neighboring Pakistan in retaliation for this surprising attack by the Pakistanis on militant groups in eastern Sistan Baluchistan province. And there was a lot of confusion and frustration with the foreign ministry that why are you doing this without us talking to our Pakistani neighbors? And so I think we're going to see a bit more of that, not just because of Mohammad Mokhber being by interim caretaker president, but I think it's just that, you know, the situation on the ground's dire. You have an ailing supreme leader who's 85, and you know, I think they're going to be making some calculations that we don't expect over the next weeks and months to come. And I think that just the instance of how the events with Israel played out in Pakistan really exemplify that.
Other gentlemen?
Yeah, maybe I can take that. You know, as I said in my initial comments, I think if we talk about a major tension or sort of a military conflict, I really don't expect that even Raisi was his presence or not presence really that much matters. You know, these are areas that are very much dealt with by different mechanisms and institutions, which are the Supreme National Security Council, as I said, the General Staff of the Armed Forces, IRGC and Artesh. And I think the system is robust and quite functioning there at that level. And I don't expect that much impacts Iran's position on major tensions like that. What probably have an impact, as I said again, is this possibility of Iran taking initiative and using some of the political opportunities that might open in the region. Because that foreign ministry now will be more downgraded than what it was before. And that's because of the institutional and the agent reason. And as I said, that might, you know, undermine, because of exactly this incompetency of Mokhber and and the current acting foreign minister in some files, that may force other institutions in Islamic Republic to step in and take that role. I said the case of the Quds forces deliberately because there also, if you look back to how this giant came into the force, was based on the urgency, based on the fact that at that time it was needed to create something, and that institution put initiative and take the initiative and put forward an idea, and it was successful in implementing that. So it very much depends on the type and sort of crisis. If that is military, I don't think that we really see anything. If that is more a diplomatic opportunity, probably we'll see a decline. That's why files like the nuclear dialogue with the United States, these are probably the areas that might be impacted a lot. Files like the regional dialogue with the Arab states of the Persian Gulf, these are the areas that might be impacted in the long term.
Do you believe that any of the possible candidates would be more negative on the dialogue with the region or the nuclear file than the previous government?
If just shortly before Dr. Azizi takes that, I think no, because as I said, I think the next presidency is the continuation of the Raisi too. So I really don't see that much change on regional file too, because that is the urgency of the Islamic Republic at this moment. I mean, the neighborhood policy, I don't really that much give it the credit of that to the Ebrahim Raisi and his administration. This was the urgency of a systemic urgency that comes out of the continuation of maximum pressure and a long-term sanction. So any government that comes after that would probably follow the same path.
Could I take you for a moment from Tehran to Washington and Berlin and some other capitals? I have been somewhat surprised, but maybe it's been drowned out by other news, at the almost total lack of reaction and apparent interest, at least for the public, in the United States, in Europe, elsewhere, China and Russia. Do you believe, and let me start with the United States and Europe first, then go to other countries, are any of them in a position to influence what is happening now in Iran? And are any of them seriously looking, is anyone taking this seriously in the outside world right now?
If I may. So actually, one of the things that was rather surprising, and also it was quite highlighted in Iran by the state media, was the messages of condolences coming from Europe and the United States. So there's different ways of interpreting that, and in connection to what you suggested, in terms of possibility or impossibility of finding ways to influence Iran's behavior. So those might be, at least as far as I can tell about Europe, might be some goodwill gestures in order not to shut the door to any sort of future engagements with Iran, especially at a time when Europe is facing a dilemma, because what was basically about, or maybe solely about, the nuclear file, I mean, in terms of Europe's Iran policy, now has developed into Iran being existential threat, or at least partner to an existential threat to Europe, which is Russia. So any sort of way that they could find to influence Iranian policies could be welcomed by the Europeans. So this is about how it is perceived on Europe's side. But I really doubt that, and this is quite in line. I totally agree with whatever Farzam said, Dr. Divsallar said. I fully agree that when it comes to Iran, the decision has already been made. And not only with regard to Iran's neighborhood policy, but also when it comes to Iran's look to the east, for example. They started even before Raisi came to power. After the maximum pressure, we started to see the first signs of this Iran neighborhood policy that then develops during Raisi term. When Rouhani traveled to Iraq, when Zarif started to speak about the security architecture in the Persian Gulf, all these sort of things, and also the 25-year agreement with China was negotiated and agreed before Raisi. So what I'm going to say is that this is the strategic decision on the side of the Islamic Republic to first shift the foreign policy almost totally toward the east, and also to work on the neighbors. And believe me, the regional delegations coming to Iran at the level of, for example, the Emir of Qatar, or the Foreign Minister of Saudi Arabia, or even more important, the Foreign Minister of Egypt, these are seen as signs that this policy has been kind of successful. So the impression is that we really don't need to care maybe what Europe wants, or the West in general wants. We are going to stick to this policy. So that's the sort of outcome that I can see. The impact of the West overall on Iran's foreign policy decisions is going to even decrease than what was before.
I think very enlightening. Any other thoughts, Dr. Holly, Dr. Abdolrasool?
Maybe I just add a very short point, and that's from the European perspective, at least. When it comes to EU-Iran relation, we are in a very delicate moment that for any EU politician, decision making about Iran when it comes to change of a policy, the broader EU policy toward Iran at this moment is costly. Dealing with Iranians from the European side is politically costly for Europe. And that is not changed by the death of Raisi. So we are seeing there are some systemic factors which have not really changed. And this is costly because of the Mahsa Amini, because of the protests and the suppressions that took place in Iran, because of the provisions of military assistance to Russia, which none of them has stopped or been changed. So basically, until there is not any sort of change in that side of the policy, there is no driver for Europeans to take initiative. Well, one may argue that it can have some impacts when it comes to nuclear file, like for example Europe's decision for a snapback, or that's the debate about the snapback might be a bit impacted because of the slowdown of Iranian bureaucracy, and that the questions that it may raise on the European side, that if they trigger it shortly after the president, they may kill the political opportunity of possible dealing with the next president. So these are the sort of debates that we might see in future. But any open public change of a position, I don't expect.
Holly, you're leaning forward. I don't know if that was...
I was just going to note that, we're talking about Europeans and the West in general, and the Joseph Biden administration and the EU and Britain itself don't have an Iran policy. They haven't had one in the past few years. And this is in the context of Tehran arming Russia with Shahed drones in Ukraine, so being on Europe's doorstep, the Women Life Freedom Uprising, and its indirect involvement in October 7th by supplying arms and money to Hamas. So, even with these three world-changing issues, like, you're not seeing any Western nation really wanting to deal with Tehran, and it's because it hasn't been a priority for them. In the U.S., where I'm at, in Washington, the administration thinks this is a headache that needs to go away. And it was a headache from the moment they took office, and they were hoping that it would be dealt with through the JCPOA revival, which never happened. And then all the other things I just mentioned took up the timeline. But even with those three big items, they still don't think it's a priority. They think that China, Russia, the economy, and now, of course, the election, and at the time, the coronavirus or pandemic and climate change are the issues. And I don't really understand what it'll take to actually make Iran a priority for said countries, but it's Iran looms large. And I think that, yes, Raisi's dead and it won't change the policies of the Islamic Republic, but we also have to recognize that this is a country that has 2 UN Security Council members as backers, Russia and China, that it has basically, to an extent, had brought its Arab neighbors to its knees. You have neighboring Gulf countries paying their respects, restarting relations with Tehran or recommencing them, countries that had pulled out their ambassadors just years ago. So I think we really need to think about how do we plan to deal with Iran moving forward, or the Islamic Republic to be precise.
I agree with you. I think that particularly on the foreign policy side, anyone who believes that the Iranians are in retrogression is fooling himself. They've been quite successful in the Gulf. They made a point, they frightened us enough to convince the Israelis not to strike back at a time when I believe the Israelis really wanted to. We put a lot of, we put pressure on the Israelis for lots of things that they've not listened to. But this one, which was sort of heaven sent, the opportunity to extend the war and save Mr. Netanyahu, they passed up. And I think they passed up because of American pressure. So, Iran's foreign policy is doing really quite well, in my opinion, quite well being a relative term, of course. Domestically, they're not doing very well at all. Do you see something on the horizon that could, in fact, upset the process, either of the re-election of the president or the internal faction fighting inside Iran, or perhaps something big enough to threaten the Islamic Republic? All this, say, in the next year or so.
Ooh, that's the $1 million question. If only I had a crystal ball for it. I think we have to acknowledge that the Women Life Freedom Uprising was the biggest threat to the Islamic Republic in its four-decade history. And I know that it's not a big news item anymore. People might argue it's dead because they're not seeing protesters, but day in and day out, Iranians are still protesting in some shape or form, whether it's not abiding by mandatory hijab rules, celebrating Ebrahim Raisi's death, as I described earlier, or not partaking in elections like the one that's going to happen on June 28th. I expect that also to have a historically low turnout. And so as long as systemic mismanagement, corruption, and repression exists, which it will, I don't see that this public will be okay with the status quo. The way that the Islamic Republic is going, I think it's bringing its own demise. Do I say when or how? But you highlighted they're doing very well on the foreign policy front. And that's exactly what happened to the Shah. Foreign policy-wise, very strong. But domestically, very bad. And to me, if we're going to bring history in here, I see those commonalities. I don't know if and when that will happen, but I also really think that because of the divisions in society, economic classes, and of course, between the generation gaps, you have these geriatric leaderships at the top dealing with Gen Z and soon to be Gen Alpha. And so there's a real disconnect between what their people want, which are basic needs and wants of people everywhere, and what the regime wants for its people. And it just doesn't seem sustainable. And I'll just note something Dr. Ali Ansari at St. Andrews had said. He had called this a pre-revolutionary phase. And again, I don't know when or how that will happen, but I really think we need to really look at Iran through this lens of it falling apart, because it really is coming apart at the seams.
I'm glad you brought up history. I'm a fanatic believer in the old mantra about those who fail to read history are doomed to repeat it. And Mark Twain, of course, he said history doesn't always repeat itself, but it rhymes. For the other two on the panel, any thoughts on on Holly's comments right now?
If I may, I actually agree with this argument. Of course, that there's a significant imbalance between Iranian foreign policy and its domestic politics. Although, as someone who's been focusing more on the foreign and regional aspect, that also has to do with changing international environment. I mean, it has to do more with the global geopolitical trends than to certain initiatives on the side of Iran. Because as I said, this sort of, for example, neighborhood policy was there before Raisi. What happened was actually the war in Ukraine and the intensified, if you may say, rivalry between the United States and China. I mean, these global geopolitical changes are impacting the way that non-Western actors are approaching the region, and as a result, the freedom of action that fellow revisionist states at the regional level, in this specific case Iran, are basically, how they are redefining their policies. So this is the first thing. Then it has to do also with regional trends. In this case, again, the war in Gaza. I mean, the way that it has developed, it would be beyond Iran's, best plans or expectations. The way that, for example, Israel's disagreement with some sort of settlement is basically changing the equation on the ground and also internationally. It favors Iran. So Iran really doesn't need to do any big initiative to win that. So this is about the foreign policy. But the domestic politics, actually, what I can see is that exactly because of the factors that Holly mentioned, and because I think actually the Islamic Republic leaders are quite well in learning from history their own ways. And they won't let the society to feel that they are weak. And this is actually what we saw in the recent episode between Israel and Iran. When at the same time as the tit for tat attacks was, the risk for further escalation was still there. They started this campaign against hijab, a kind of more intensified campaign. What was the reason? To my understanding, it was more than anything about projecting a power of strength domestically and ruled by fear. So as long as these challenges exist and that sort of systematic weakness is there, we are going to see more of repression, more of closure of the public space. So two scenarios emerge here. Both should be somehow in the short term, and then they will determine the longer term trends. There will be either some sort of accelerated move towards a revolution, for example, as Holly mentioned, which I would see as a less likely scenario because, because of the opposition politics, because of the divisions inside, because of a lot of factors, this seems like a less likely scenario. Another one would be the current trend, the current trajectory towards a post-Khamenei succession, and then based on the form of the political system, because I believe that we are not only speaking about the person who is going to replace Khamenei. We may see a sort of a systemic change in the Islamic Republic in the way that is going to be governed, and then based on the sort of state-society relations that's going to be defined after Khamenei. The trend again would be the continuation of revolutionary moves or some sort of a compromise between a state and society. So what I want to say is that it's really tricky. It's very complicated, and there's no kind of bright, or better to say, clear way ahead that we can predict.
Very, very interesting. Dr. Abdolrasool? Yes, please.
If I can add a very short note, knowing of the time constraints, I think it's important that we notice that the elites in Islamic Republic are stability seekers. They are looking for the stability of the system. For them, that is important because they all know collectively that their privileged position will be guaranteed by the stability of the system. So I understand that this approach, probably can help us to better grasp the notion of competition when we talk about competition inside the elites. This competition inside elites, yes, it can cause certain crisis or instabilities, but at the same time, it has its own threshold. It has its own boundaries. So that those boundaries are managed by partly by this shared interest, collective interest that I said, that no one of them wants to see instability or chaos in the system because they know that their environment is threatful, either the society or the outside. So they are wary of this, they're aware of this fact. And also because of somehow clarity in the constitution. You know, if you look at the transitional periods, either for president or for the leader, you have sort of a constitutional clarity there that will help them to manage this transition process. So these are the two factors, you know, the natural tendency of the elite for a collective stability, and the fact that, you know, the constitution is also assisting them for this factor, is causing that, you know, the assumptions about expecting a sort of an internal instability or an issue in these transitional phases cannot be necessarily realistic. And one more important, I mean, this case of transition from this president, which was a surprise death of a current president, somehow can probably tell us something about how the next transition could look like. You know, this is a practice, this is a sort of exercise for the system to understand that how it should do the transition processes, and you know, we should wait a bit and see that how smoothly they can do this transition, what probably insights we can learn from that, and then we probably have better ideas of how that next transition, which is of course a bigger and more strategic transition, probably would look like.
Thank you. We all agree that Khamenei is one seriously concerned about his legacy and who will replace him, and that he does not seem to have any particular policy on governance. Am I wrong? Are there factions that would like to govern Iran in a different way within the ruling elite, within the class of people who are campaigning right now for the president? Are there differences between them in philosophy of government and how they want to operate, or is it simply I want to be president?
Maybe I can have a short answer. Yes, I think one of the longest projects of Khamenei was what he likes to call it Olgu Islam Irani Pishraft, or Iranian Islamic development progress, model of progress, which basically he created a center almost 2 decades ago, more than 2 decades ago, where basically that center should work as a sort of a place that modulized this governance approach. He further, created another similar institute to theorize his governance approach in Iran's National Defense University. There is a faculty there that is doing and it's called the Faculty of Governance, and it's really dealing with this question that you raised. But honestly, both of these experiences seems to being a failure, and that's exactly why the reformist project is coming into. That's the position of the reformist government, which basically are providing a different approach to the governance of the country, which is basically very much in contrast with Khamenei. So yes, I think we can distinguish an attempt by Khamenei to theorize, to bringing into practice a sort of Islamic-based governance model, but that was basically failure, and that's exactly created a space and a hope that the reformists might somehow fill this gap.
Power right now under Khamenei, presumably a lot of these factions depend on their control of different parts of the economy, or either financial corruption or political corruption. Control different parts of the economy, different parts of governance. Are there any of those factions that, in fact, might be regarded as more pragmatic, or are most of them trapped within the narrow bounds of the philosophies of the revolution?
So, if I may, actually, almost all of them are pragmatic in their own sense, in the sense that they are competing for power. And back to the previous question, actually, somehow, I think because these two elements are quite connected, I think there are factions, there are people with visions of their own. As I mentioned, for example, Ghalibaf is an example. But the thing is that at the moment, and as I mentioned again in the beginning of my presentation, transition to post-Khamenei, the succession issue, the succession question is now the key driver. So for now, all factions are kind of concentrated on grasping power and expanding their power base, making sure that they are well positioned for the day that Khamenei dies. And then after that comes the moment that they may, go for their own vision of kind of governance. Because, the Islamic Republic as a political system, I mean, it's of course very, very complicated. The stability factor that Dr. Divsallar rightly mentioned also has to do with economic interests, because, for example, considering IRGC, especially the economic elements of it, like Khatam al-Anbiya construction headquarters, like a lot of other, big or small companies or initiatives run by the IRGC. They need, of course, some sort of stability in order to continue their work and in order to flourish. They also need, for example, not any meaningful improvements in the relationship with the West because they are benefiting from the sanctions. So these are actually, what I want to say is that this sort of pragmatism of their own is what is determining some part of the policy, even when it comes to confrontation with the West. It's not all about ideology. It also has to do with economic interest. So in that sense, I mean, after having this kind of broader picture, then we can go into this factional divides. Of course, I do believe that there are more pragmatic figures, but then again, especially at this very specific moment, the key is that their interests are tied to the Islamic Republic remaining in place in some sort. So that's why when it comes to, any existential threat pops up, they unify. Now is the time for more competition, but we shouldn't mistake this for some sort of kind of regime against anti-regime elements or any fundamental divisions within the system.
Thank you. We've got a few more minutes left, and I'd like to ask a question. The United States has, since the time of the Islamic Revolution, put Iran in the permanent enemy category. Something like Russia, something occasionally like China is still not a permanent enemy. But there are countries, every country has a country next to it that it doesn't like, and for some reason, after the Islamic Revolution of the hostage-taking, my country chose to categorize Iran as always the enemy. That was so just a comment on my part. But in the last few minutes, could you each take what should the United States be doing within the realm of the possible that would influence Iran to move in directions that would improve the relationship between the two countries? I don't know if there's anybody who actually wants to improve the relationship, but just if there is, what should the United States be doing? Let's take it in the same order that we started the program. Ali?
That's a loaded question. Well, I think that there was a two-way street with radicals taking over the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, like you mentioned, for 444 days. And that legacy has haunted, I think, a lot of officials from the 80s till present as they've taken the helms of the upper echelons of U.S. government. And the United States, I would say, tried to extend that hand during the years of the JCPOA. That was the point of the JCPOA to an extent. It was tied to the nuclear deal. Point was to curb Iran's controversial nuclear program exchange for sanctions relief and to bring the Islamic Republic out from the cold and encourage economic development and a whole host of other things. And that's what the Iranian people wanted at the time. But a lot of things happened. There was, of course, the U.S. withdrawal from this multilateral agreement under the Trump administration, despite Tehran not violating the deal at the time. And there was systemic mismanagement also on the ground that made it hard for European countries in that very tiny span to actually get involved in Iran's economy, and start trade ties. There was some to an extent, but there was a lot of red tape and confusion and corruption involved as well. So whatever was that small opportunity is gone, and I would say it's permanently gone, because Iran is not in 2015. The Islamic Republic or Iran is not in the year 2015. They're in 2024. The world dynamics have changed. The people inside the country don't like their government, and they've tried that opportunity and believe reform is dead. And overwhelming number of them want this regime gone. And so I don't think that you're going to see a reformist faction take over and that there's going to be change in the country. And I would say part of it is because, as we were talking about earlier, is that this faction is no longer relevant because the people don't want it. They themselves have chanted and said that hardliners' reformist scheme is over. But also the clerical establishment, Khamenei himself is not allowing these groups to actually gain political space anymore. They've disqualified them from parliamentary elections. They've disqualified them from presidential election, and made it abundantly clear that they just want a hardline dominated system that's purely where power is consolidated purely to hardliners. And the only diversity you're going to see is who's more hardliner than the next guy. And so I think this hope that Iran's going to change or reform itself, I think we really need to stop thinking in that framework and accept the fact that reform is dead and that things will never go back to the way they used to be.
Dr. Hamidreza?
Yeah, sure. I'll be quick. I agree with what Holly said, and I would just add that the strategic vision in terms of how the Islamic Republic is seeing the world, that has also changed. As I mentioned, this kind of global geopolitical rivalries, regional developments, all these sort of things have given rise to the idea that we actually don't need to have an improvement in the relationship with the West. So as far as the strategic thinking on the Iranian side is concerned, the options would be something between tensions management to overt confrontation. So nothing beyond this scope. So overt confrontation, of course, is something for the more ideologically driven parts of the hardliners or ultra hardliners. It's even hard to pronounce hardliner. And of course, tension management. Even we can hear these days from somebody like Zarif, who was the architect of the JCPOA on the Iranian side. They have also given up hope on that. So I think whatever the United States wants to do, regardless of the administration in place, should be with an eye with this kind of perception, so that the best they can achieve in relations with Iran would be tensions management. How enduring that would be is a matter of technicalities if they can achieve something.
Dr. Abdolrasool.
Well, most of things was said by my colleagues. I think just a very short adding to the points. Look, the fact is that I think Islamic Republic at the end is very much looking for its security. So there is security concerns from the Iranian side when it comes to its relation with the United States. That means that still, I think the relevancy of the United States for Iranians is huge, because the Islamic Republic is believing that if there is a major threat coming to it, it is coming through the United States. So that makes United States relevant. And that means that in whatever administration and whatever leadership, there would be always an attempt to somehow solve the problem with the United States. I don't want to say that solving of the problem would be resolution of every issue that they have, but at least as in the lines that Hamidreza was mentioned, sort of, crisis management or having a model of controlling their tensions. That is there. But what probably would be the longer term solution, I think, is that we are in a very different situation rather than 2015, in which the JCPOA deal was made, and actually there was a deliberate decision by the Europeans, by the US, to compartmentalize issues with Iran, like the nuclear and the regional file and other things. I think now the environment is in a much better mood because of Iran's improvement of relation with the region. And because also Iranians have understood that they cannot really solve the nuclear file if they do not touch other things. So this opens a bit of possibility for more comprehensive discussions between the United States and Iran. There's one factor here which I think has been increasingly becoming important, and that is the Israeli factor in the US-Iran thing. That has been always been a factor, but I think now we are in a moment that the Israeli factor between Iran and the US can put United States in a course of war with Iran too. So one of the for sure options and areas that needs to work on is to crisis management between Iran and Israel. I think we need to come up with some ideas that how that sort of battle should be managed, what rules of engagement should be there by both sides. We cannot accept Iranian missile strike to Israel, and we cannot accept Israeli strikes back in different manners and subversion operations. Both of them are sort of destabilizing as I see it. So United States can play a role here and try to reduce the negative impact of other external actors in its sort of dialogue with Iran.
Well, thank you very much. We've got a couple of minutes left. I'd like to ask one quick and somewhat silly question. Who's going to be president? Just you got 15 seconds each. Ali?
That's a hard one to answer, honestly. I think we don't even know who's thrown their hats in to at least give us an idea. But I think that Bagher Ghalibaf, as I think Hamidreza had mentioned earlier, is definitely a top possibility as a candidate.
Dr. Hamidreza?
I mean, I think Ghalibaf is already trying for that, but he may even not be allowed to run. So what I can say is that Iran always has surprises for us. So I wouldn't bet on any figure at this moment.
And where's your money, Dr. Abdolrasool?
Well, I don't bet on that. Let me don't put a name on the table because it's really unclear, I think.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a fascinating discussion for me particularly, I believe for our audience, and let's look forward to the future. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.